we are live. A few minutes for quality control. Make sure some people show up a little bit. Interesting. All right. Trying a slightly new arrangement here. Those of you who watched my videos before know that I usually sit slightly in a different place, but this might allow you the singular pleasure of seeing a child running that somewhere right there randomly, so that might be fun. Plus I feel like I need to stand today. It's been a long day. I've been sitting most of it. All right, almost there. Just a few more minutes. Okay, looks like Facebook is finally caught up. It's not doing well today. There is a crying baby outside that will totally distract me. Oh dear. Sounds like he hit something. This is my third, who's been getting into a lot of scrapes. Literal and metaphorical. Oh, good grief. Anyway. Just want to make sure nothing's broken. Oh, there's the baby. Second child over there. Hello, everybody. All right, we're just about to get started. Hello, Moses. Good to see you. I can't see all of your comments. Thank you. If you want to say hi, go ahead in the comments. I will. Any comment that I feel is interesting, I will also share with the rest of the group, just so you all know. Okay, I have to move this a little bit, otherwise Grandpa's not going to be happy. Like that. Oh, man. How do we do this? All right, this is going to be a little bit... He's outside! He's outside and he hit something. He's outside and he's crying. Today's one of those days when us working people need to make interesting sacrifices just to get through the day. Hello and welcome. My name is Nicholas Kotar. I'm an Orthodox deacon. I'm a fantasy author. I'm a fairy tale podcaster, and I'm a blogger on the intersection of culture creation and everyday life over at nicholaskotar.com, where you can find all the stuff that I do. I post there fairly regularly. I go live on my author page at 5 p.m. every Friday, unless something extra special is happening on that Friday, as I am today, weekly, to talk about the different cultural topics and to consider, together with all of you, how reading good stories can help us lead a great life. Today, I'm going to start with a little personal update. For those of you who follow me know that most of my writing happens in the form of novels, novellas, blogs, and now short stories and fairy tales over at the In a Certain Kingdom podcast over at Ancient Faith, which you should check out if you haven't yet. It just launched last week. But I have a little bit of an interesting announcement. Recently, my good friend and collaborator Benedict Sheehan, who is a composer, choral conductor, and basically Renaissance man, was recently commissioned to do a large-scale, major choral symphonic narrative piece. Now, those of you who have followed me know that I do a lot of work with Artifact Institute, one of the founding members. It's an organization that gets people together and considers the idea that it's not enough for us to simply live in our culture, but it's important for us to create culture, because the culture that we seem to live in right now is definitely on the downswing and is not doing everything it can to help us lead a good and beautiful life. So we have done several concerts, we've done courses both online and in person, we've done events over at Louisville in particular, and now we are going to be presenting this new piece a long, long piece. It's going to take a while for us to make it, but I'm very excited about the potential. The idea behind it is basically going to be centered on a very interesting hymn that was written at the beginning of the 20th century called the Cathist Glory to God for All Things. This is a piece that was written by a retired metropolitan in the Russian church right around the time of the revolution, who lived during the beginning and the continuation of the persecutions of the church in Russia in the beginning of the 20th century, but was himself never tortured or repressed, as the word that they use, in any way, luckily. But he was a man of great. He was a man greatly honored by many people, and a lot of people came and visited him and shared their sufferings, their experiences, their troubles with him. And he ended up writing this incredible hymn that, in the face of much adversity, much pain, and much darkness, ends up focusing almost exclusively on the beautiful, on the ineffable, on the things that, like I mentioned last week with Sam noticing the shining star in the sky in Mordor, and that reminded him that all of this is but a passing shadow, and ultimately the good things are eternal, and towards which we must still reach, even when we think that we're about to fall over and die. That was the same kind of spirit with which this metropolitan wrote this wonderful hymn. And this hymn is going to provide the narrative substructure of the piece that I'm going to be writing. That's the part I didn't tell you. I'm writing the narrative portion for Benedict's new piece, whatever it's going to be. We don't know what it's going to look like yet. But in preparation for it, I started to read different things. I wanted to read widely. I still want to read widely, not simply in fiction, but in different genres. And I believe, as many people do, that when we set our heart and our mind towards something, and we keep a humble, low profile and keep our eyes open, kind of our antennae pointed upward, it's really interesting what kinds of things start to come across our path, what kind of books, what kind of ideas, what kind of people that we never would have normally encountered, but that suddenly are exactly what we need at that particular given moment. This happens a lot, and I think the more receptive you are to it, the more it tends to happen, especially if you try to accept it with a kind of humble spirit and not expect that these things are something that come out of the source of your own brilliance or something like that. That's nonsense. So I noticed coming across me, I can't even remember where I saw it, a memoir of an emergency room physician called The Beauty in Breaking, or Beauty in Breaking. Hey, David is finally figured out how to join this. Excellent. Good to see you, David. How are you? So this is a memoir written by an emergency room physician who also happens to be a woman of color. Michelle Harper is her name. It's a really interesting, fascinating book. I'm about halfway through, and I have very mixed emotions about it. I will tell you that it is a fantastically written book, and it's probably something that I'm going to give 5 stars to, regardless of how it ends or how I feel about the author's politics or the author's view of the world. I feel like I still am going to give it 5 stars simply because of the force with which it's written, and simply because it forces me to encounter a reality that certainly we don't come across every day. That's the reality of the suffering of people in their absolutely worst conditions in emergency rooms. It's a fascinating book. It's really wonderful. It starts, however, not from Michelle as an emergency room doctor, but Michelle as a child. And as a girl who was upper middle class, lived in an affluent black neighborhood in Washington, D.C., in the Washington, D.C. area, but whose family had a hidden secret, and that is that the father was an abuser. That he was physically abusive towards her mother, and I believe towards her as well. I can't remember the details off the top of my head. This is the way the book starts, and it's really interesting to know that this is a character, a person who has passed through a terrible darkness when she was a child, and you know that she's going to get through it because she's an emergency room physician. She's done well for herself. So at least on the surface, things for her seem to be going well. Now, in the very beginning, there was an incredibly affecting scene that I'm going to share with you. If I can figure out there it is, okay. I'm using my Kindle app. I'm going to share with you one of the first scenes in the book, and I'm going to share it with you because it really affected me, but it also affected me in conjunction with the later episode in her own life. Here's what she has to say. After moving to Washington, D.C. when I was 4 years old, my family proceeded to change homes 3 times within a 4-mile distance. This is house number 2 on 16th Street in Northwest Washington. close to the border with Silver Spring, Maryland. I walk down the staircase that ends in the foyer, then through the foyer to the living room and finally to the fish room, so named by my sister and me for the large aquarium in its centerpiece. The people on my mother's side of the family were very superstitious. You don't walk under ladders. At all costs, you avoid breaking a mirror. You always look at the new moon over your right shoulder, and you never ever split a pole. Today, as I enter the fish room, I note that the aquarium has recently been replenished. Sun pours through the window panes. I settle cross-legged on the floor and masterfully jockey my team of horses, my little ponies, over each groove and shifting beam of light. They are skilled and graceful jumpers, but what else could be expected of ponies from a peaceful paradise estate? As this is happening, I'm going to condense because it does go on for a little bit. As this is happening, her father is attacking her mother, and her brother is running into the room to try to stop him because the noise that she hears as she's coming down the stairs is the noise of her mother choking. Then, as if on Pegasus wings, I feel a presence floating with me in the room, next to the red velvet sofa, in front of the fish tank which faces the bay window. When I look for it, it is just me, alone in the softly lit room. I see no one, though I feel and hear a gentle essence. Her voice is so familiar that when she speaks, it's as if the words were my own. Michelle, you are okay. You will be okay. You will be safe. Your mother will be safe. Your brother and sister will be safe. The benediction continues. You will live. You must. Your mother will live. Your brother and sister will live. You will grow to see that you help many people. You will grow to do great service. You must. I knew about guardian angels from TV shows. There were always visions in white gowns, with expansive wings who float on beds of cumulus clouds. There was no visual for mine, just a voice that sounded clear and sure, an articulation that permeated the room. It is this very message that buttressed me for the next 2 decades of my life. Now, this is I found this to be a really interesting thing because, we're used in our materialistic world where we expect our affluent and our elites to look down on any such manifestations of the spiritual as being, manifestations of a tortured imagination or something like this. And yet here we have, a New York Times best-selling author who's quite open about some sort of spiritual experience that she had, a kind of emanation of her mother's blessing in the form of some sort of presence. Okay, now, whatever you might believe about the reality of such things or what they might actually be, that's not what I want to talk about here. What I want to talk about is how this, she says herself, is the thing that directed her to become a servant of the suffering and to serve others with her life. Something we often hear from emergency room physicians. So I was really surprised and rather disturbed when in a scene in the emergency room already, I'll set the scene for you. There's a man who has been admitted who frequently comes into the emergency room with various problems in his inguinal area. That's his groin area. He's got hernias. He's got hemorrhoids. Yes, some of this stuff's going to be a little bit unpleasant. I apologize. And he frequently comes in, and he's kind of well known. She's never encountered him, but as she's preparing for his coming in for another visit to the emergency room, she sees a little notice on his chart that says that he, and pardon me for those who might have children in the area, sexually assaulted a doctor in the previous encounter. Dr. Harper then proceeds to explain her feelings of fury and her feelings of anger at, as she says, being forced to treat this man. She tries to find in herself the empathy to relate to this person, and she begins to come up with various situations in which maybe he was a changed man. Perhaps he had been abused himself as a child. Perhaps he had gone through therapy. Perhaps he was a different person now. But that's all fine and good, and that's something that I think all of us should try to do when we are relating to people whom we personally loathe, especially when we are in positions of service. Or actually, we should do it all the time because we're human beings. But what really struck me is that she let something pass. She let something slip. And it seems to me like it was almost unconscious. And that was that she was, by law, required to treat this man. And that's why she was going to go and treat him. And this was a passing comment in the chapter there, describing the situation with this man. I'm not going to read it because I don't want to spend too much time on it. And it's almost that she didn't notice that she had said it. It just slipped out, even in her writing. And I found that incredibly interesting. And perhaps not surprisingly, her takeaway from the episode is not, here I am in a position of authority and power over this man who tried to assert his power over women in ways that were inappropriate and, frankly, horrifying and abhorrent, rather than saying, here I am in a position where I can heal him, thereby giving him the good that he was not able to give to others, which would have been my natural expectation as a reader. And of course, it kind of reveals the fact that I have a Christian worldview, a worldview in which we are called, whether it works or not, whether we are able to do it or not, no matter how often or how not often we are capable of actually putting this into practice, of overcoming our own personal loathing, our own personal antipathy towards people, especially when they are suffering. So I expected that to be her response. Her response was different. Her response was to see this man who actually this time was in very serious pain. There was a ruptured hernia, and he was in intense, incredible pain, very pacific towards the female, the female doctors, 3 of whom were tending for him. And all she could come away with that from this episode was this picture in her head of a man who had shown himself to be more powerful than women by asserting himself in a sexual way, in an inappropriate way towards a doctor before, now being lorded over by 3 women. And she says, I hope he comes away from this experience having his own worldview challenged. And that's where she stops with it. It is actually a really, really amazing book. And I stopped there and I'm like, wait a minute. There's something not wrong here, but there's something here that, yeah, it might be wrong. I'm not judging her. I'm really trying to express something here that is outside of judgment. I'm trying to say that I noticed something that came out in her response to the situation that to me seemed completely not what I had hoped to get out of this episode. If it's a book about healing, if it's a book about a person called to heal others, I would have hoped that in that chapter, the takeaway would be, in spite of the fact that this man had done violence to my kind, to women, how interesting, how fitting it is that the women were then giving him goodness. But that wasn't the takeaway. The takeaway was, oh, look, the power position has been flipped. Maybe he'll come away from this situation with a new worldview. And it really struck me, and I had to stop reading. I'm like, wait a minute, what is it that is bothering me about this situation? And the rest of the book, I've gotten up to about 60%, continues in a similar vein. She gets more and more compassionate as the book goes on. That's definitely the case. But throughout it all, we are constantly hearing about her personal dealing with the reality of systemic racism, and she is looking at her journey, her difficulties, and the difficulties of people of color and people of marginalized communities exclusively through almost the expected lens, and the expected lens of marginalization and of the need to overcome that marginalization through renewed attempts at taking power. What am I trying to get at here? That, as the farther we get into the book, the more bitter she seems to be getting. I haven't gone to the end. I don't know how it all ends for her. But she's getting more and more personally tired, more and more personally overwhelmed by the reality of the discrimination that she's facing in a real way every single day. And that made me think, what would her journey have been like if she had had a slightly different upbringing? I'm trying to be compassionate here and not impose impossible expectations on people who grow up in extremely difficult circumstances. I'm trying to make a larger point about what it is that stories do to us, good fairy tales do to us, that actually serve us for a very long time throughout the rest of our lives. There's a comment here about not sure if people of different skin are moving apart. I see the opposite. I see more alliance and solidarity than ever before. I don't see it. I see more people of different colors being involved in the protest movements. That's certainly the case. But I don't think that's an expression of greater solidarity. But I don't want to talk about that because we can argue about that for a long time, and that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is less about skin color, and it's more about what happens to us when we grow up in disadvantaged situations, when we grow up faced with discrimination, when we grow up faced with pain, suffering. Two things seem to happen. Either the person becomes really bitter and driven by that bitterness to go and do something very important in one's life, or that person becomes an incredibly empathetic human being with the ability to cover other people's darkness with his or her own light. Why is it that some people go one way and some people go the other? And I think it might have something to do with the kinds of stories that we imbibe. And it really struck me as I was recording episode 5 of In a Certain Kingdom just today. This is a story, the story that I was recording and that is going to come out next week on Thursday or Friday, is the story of Vasilisa the Beautiful. This is a story about a girl. Basically, it's Cinderella in the Russian version with slight, very interesting modifications. She is in a situation where she is constantly abused by her stepmother. And yet, her response to the stepmother is not one of antagonism. She never blames them, and her life ends up taking an entirely different route, one in which she takes on a great degree of personal difficulty and suffering and comes out, as all fairy tales do, happily ever after married to the king. Now, what I'm trying to suggest about the story is actually more than just simply the glory of a happy ending that we sometimes can't have in real life. What I'm suggesting is something that happens in the story, and that is that she is a blessed child. She's a child of blessing. She's a child whose mother died when she was young and passed on her blessing through a doll that talks, a doll that is able to do things. A very interesting and very bizarre image. Now, this doll ends up doing a lot of the work for Vasilisa and helping her out in a lot of ways, saving her in situations where she even comes face to face with a very gruesome and awful death. And it struck me that Michelle Harper seems to have had a similar experience to Vasilisa in the story. She seems to have had some sort of spiritual protection, probably some sort of motherly blessing, womanly blessing, if you like, as evinced by this intense experience of having some sort of a guardian angel type figure talk to her. Just like Vasilisa has this doll talking to her and actually doing things for her and giving her a direction, giving her a path that she then must traverse herself and then do all the work along that path. Vasilisa travels that path, listens to the spiritual direction, passes through the darkness of death, and comes out on the other side with a willingness and a desire to work, to do good, to take her hands and create things with them that are beautiful and that restore order in a chaotic world. I'm not going to give too much away because I want you all to listen to the story. Miss Harper seems to be doing the same thing by becoming an emergency room physician. But she also seems, again, I'm only in the middle of the story, to be able, she seems to be unable to get past the valley of the shadow of death into a kind of eternal rebirth where she, as many physicians would like to, begins to place the sufferings of others on herself. Something I think that all human beings are called to do. Certainly that's what Christ would have of us. So what is the problem? Well, maybe she didn't have the right stories as she was growing up. And that's my point. My point is we really need, right now, this moment, as the world is really going nuts outside, as the protests are getting even worse, whether we think they are justified or not, as the crackdowns on the virus are getting worse, as the situation around the world is teetering on the brink of financial collapse, as people we walk by in the street cringe away from us from the fear of something they can't see, this is the time when we don't need external solutions. We don't need massive programs. Because even if those programs are there, even if we have government-mandated programs that are there to save us from this terrible virus, the result that I am seeing, not for everyone, but for many people, is an increase of fear, is an increase of distrust, is an increase of anger that sometimes comes out in people punching each other over masks. New York Times famously reported a case like this and continues to report because this is what sells the New York Times these days. So instead of trying to go out and fix and save the world through coming up with a better program, They're coming up with a more comprehensive vision of how to bring people of different creeds, different skin colors, different ideas, different ideologies together. I propose and I suggest that the stories teach us something different, that the Russian fairy tales in particular teach us something different. In all of them, in Vasilisa, in the Ivan stories, in all of them, there is a very clear sense that what you need to do is abandon your own desire to do, to fix, to put to right. Because as soon as you start doing that, you mess up. As soon as you start doing that, the wildness takes you. But the second that you abandon your agency, yes, you abandon your ability to do the change and step back and in some cases begin to cry for just merely from the overwhelming sense of I can't do this, or set aside that room, that space between you and that spiritual reality that came to Miss Harper and that came to the story and that comes to the storytellers, to the characters in the story. When we do that, the stories tell us, then the unlooked for help comes. That's why I really like this memoir, is that it seems to be animated, whether or not successfully for her, by this idea that there is a spiritual reality that can guide you and help you, but it only can guide and help you primarily through the changing and the softening of your own heart. Because in the softening of your own heart, something that stories do extremely well, you begin to see the world not in terms of black and white categories, not in terms of causes that need to be won, not in terms of injustices that need to be overturned, but in terms of suffering human beings who need the help of our co-suffering heart. Moses says in the context of the book, there is no other worldview that he would be convert to, but the same one he used to sexually attack the woman, the worldview of power. They both are in the same worldview. Moses, that's a fantastic point. And that is the tragedy of that particular scene, is that there is no way out of it unless one or both decide to change the paradigm completely, to set aside the paradigm of power. But that can only happen with internal change. And Moses continues and says, stories are portals to other worlds and possibilities. They dominate. The dominant modern stories from Hollywood teach that all can be resolved with power in the right hands, like the One Ring. Yeah, or the Gauntlet of Power in the Avengers movies. All you need is to put it on the right hands, in the hands of a person who sacrifices himself, which is a cool idea, but it's still about proper usage of power. And of course that doesn't work. And that's why we need those stories, the old stories, not the modern, postmodern, I should say, stories that talk to us about self-actualization, talk about even about overcoming great odds. That's all fantastic and good. But if the overcoming of great odds comes at the expense of a soft and broken heart, the kind of heart that is able to contain within itself the wholeness and the completeness of human suffering, something that this metropolitan who wrote the Akathas that I mentioned at the beginning did by creating a hymn that becomes a kind of cry of the soul for anybody who reads it. And honestly, it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever written. And it works for anybody. Anybody can read it, even if you're not religious, because it talks about things like the beauty of nature, things like the harmony of bird song, about the brilliance of scientific minds. You know, it's really incredible stuff. And where does that come from? It comes from a person who was able to contain within himself the sufferings of so many who came to him. He himself was unable to change anything externally. He was not a person in power. But had he been in power, he wouldn't have been able to change much anyway, because he recognized, as the characters in the stories do, that you have to step back from the grabbing of power. And in that moment, something ineffable, something incredible, something unusual, something wonderful can happen. That's the kind of stuff I talk about in the analysis section of my fairy tale podcast. It's something I'm thinking about a lot. I'm thinking right now in general about how I myself need a different way of looking at the world. Because when pandemic happened, I found myself flat-footed. I found myself completely emotionally unable to deal with the difficulties. I found myself depressed. I found myself scared. I found myself angry. And I don't want to be in that situation. I don't want any of you to be in that situation. And you know what it took? Well, for me, it took a return to my faith, but mediated at least partially by a deep dive into the kinds of stories that I grew up with. Because they speak to all of us in a language that we understand. It's not a language of the head, it's a language of the heart. And these stories, they bypass our rational objections, and they tell us, or rather they show us, that there's a better way of living. That's what I wish for all of you. It's what I wish for myself. It's what I wish for my kids, even as things continue to get not better around us, but more complicated and more confusing. Hopefully better in the near future and in the far future, but I don't know anymore. But that needn't matter anymore. Because if we have the right heart, if we have the soft heart, if we have a heart open to the suffering of others, I do believe that that can cause ripple effects that affect others around us in very, very real ways, in much more effective ways, I think, than social justice. That'll be my final word on that. So I do these videos once a week on Fridays at 5. If you're interested in the kinds of things that I talk about, if you're interested in me helping you find the kinds of stories that talk about culture, that talk about storytelling, talk about fantasy and science fiction, but in a slightly different perspective, not simply about the excitement of it, not simply about how cool these things are, but how they can actually help us lead a better life, I encourage and recommend that you check out my website and that you sign up for my mailing list, because I'm going to start curating not simply interesting information that I find on the internet, but the kinds of stories that affect me in ways that I think will affect you deeply, profoundly, to the changing of your life. That's what I hope for all of us. So what I hope for myself, like I said. So I recommend that you go to my website, nicholaskotar.com, and sign up for my mailing list. You'll get your first email in that new series on Monday. And that's all I wanted to say today. Just wanted to share that thought about storytelling and how both the telling and the reading and the acting out of stories and the writing of stories can all act as very strong softening agents, I think, for our very, very hard hearts. And I recommend that we all do a little bit more of that. And look out for my new episode of the In a Certain Kingdom podcast on Thursday on my website, and Friday to whenever the aggregators share it on Google Podcasts, on Stitcher, on Apple Podcasts, and on all other podcast catchers. So it's taking a little time to catch up because we just launched. Sometimes the aggregators take time to put stuff together, to gather the information from the internet. But it's going to be there, and it's going to be there fairly soon. All right, I see my third son walking around outside with slippers that aren't his, which means I need to go and take care of that situation. But anyway, I hope you're all doing well. I hope you had a good week. And I hope you find some time to read something that doesn't simply entertain you, but leaves a desire to stop, to think, to be, and to resolve to live a little bit differently, a little bit better, both for yourselves and for your families and for the world, because I think that's what we need. Okay? Thanks for coming by. Thanks for those of you who commented, and I will see you all next week, 5 p.m. Eastern, also on Facebook Live. And until then, ta-ta.